the CPU benchmark that we're working our way towards, or at least not meaningfully so, as compared to some other limitations that we have, which we're going to show you. And there are always going to be limitations. It's the nature of a benchmark. You're always bottlenecked somewhere. So we did see some other numbers where I think it was PC Games hardware, as I said, used very low-end memory. They indicated DDR5 4400 for one of their CPUs. I think it was 12900K. In that instance, yes, that will be a memory limitation. That is pretty low in memory. That's still valid information, but what it does is benchmark basically something else. It benchmarks the CPU as constrained by memory, as opposed to the CPU relatively unconstrained by memory. We just tested a couple kits rapidly to see if there's any meaningful change with our test setup. All we care about here is eliminating as much of the bottleneck as possible on things other than the CPU. So here's the chart at 1080p high with a 13900K. As you can see, compared to our 720p chart we showed earlier, we are limited in frame rate, and the, again, traditional understanding is that this is a GPU utilization issue. But memory didn't affect our results outside of run-to-run variance here, although once again, we didn't use that many kits. Here's our 1080p low chart. We didn't do any tuning here. Our standard kit is the DDR5 6000 Corsair one at 30, 36, 36, 76, which we use in our CPU reviews and tests. As you can see, it was within run-to-run variance of the DDR5 6400 kit at 32, 38, 38, 76. We also have a custom V-color kit that the company gave us when we visited previously. As far as we're aware, it doesn't have an existing SKU on the market, but that's at DDR5 7000, 38, 48, 48, 126. We were within error of the prior two kits. We had one more test with this kit at DDR5 5600. This is worse than our standard Corsair kit. That's because after seeing no change in the prior tests, we decided to leave the looser timings and then just tank the frequency to see what happened. And here we did get movement, and a lot of it. But what really matters is that for our CPU benchmark today, we don't appear to be memory bound, or at least not on the kit we're using. As for the SK Hynix kit, for that, Jeremy on the team manually configured it at DDR5 6400 and 34, 40, 40, 84. This is a dual rank kit, so we used it just in case. Ultimately, although a technically higher frame rate, it fell within our usual run-to-run variance. So we spent a couple hours working with Buildzoid on the next ideas for what could be going on, and although memory still can be a factor in testing, it does not appear to be a limiting one in our testing. So we began looking elsewhere, and he suggested a few ideas. First was disabling hyperthreading, which sometimes that improves performance, depends on the game. Next was disabling E-cores, and then additionally overclocking the 13900K towards 6 gigahertz. We settled at 5.9 for something quick and easy. So we tried each of these independently. This testing was done with our SK Hynix kit, which is different from what we're using later in the charts. This testing is also done with 50% scaling against 1080p with FSR2, which is abominably low as a resolution, and some of the worst visuals we've ever seen in a game. But it's intentional. We wanted to ensure we were definitely not GPU limited. Here's the chart. Our baseline result with these settings was 147.9 FPS average. Disabling hyperthreading didn't affect the average frame rate. It may have affected the 0.1% lows here though. We'd have to run it more times to be sure. Overclocking to 5.9 gigahertz with hyperthreading off boosted us to 155.4 FPS average, which is an increase over stock of 5.1%. So it appears we're clock bound. Adding a cache overclock to 49x boosted us to 156.1 FPS average, mostly error of the prior results, but possibly an improvement. Disabling E-cores hurt the performance to below stock, even in spite of the overclock, although it's possible that E-cores off with hyperthreading on might produce a better result. We also ran these numbers with the 7900 XTX, yielding about the same maximum improvement over the 4090 as we saw in the earlier tests, so about 3.7%. The improvement over baseline indicates that we were CPU clock limited, and overclocking helped here again. We did learn one thing though, which is that we were definitely clock bound at the upper end of the results. And now it's time to get into the CPU benchmarks we've been promising and that we originally set out to do. It was a long journey to get here. This was supposed to be a very simple video. In fact, this part was done in like a day. It was a long day, but it got done fast. So remember that these are accurate as tested, regardless of the game or the driver's issues right now. These still give you insight as to how it performs. We expect this will change as either Bethesda well, actually definitely Bethesda, patch things, possibly NVIDIA. So if you're viewing this weeks or months in the future, check back. We'll probably have other benchmarks. They might be buried in a CPU or a GPU review though, and that'll be where we have newer data. Okay, here's the chart where we got the most scaling, but at the least realistic settings, and that's fine. We're starting with pure scaling at 1080p low. This helps people on older hardware have a better idea for their limitations, and most of this hardware is going to be limited by the CPU not the other components, even with all the oddities, especially true for the older stuff. Anything with DDR4 is on our prior CPU test methodology kit that we've previously shown to be a strong performer. That's a 3200 to 1414 kit. At 1080p low, we're starting to become limited at the 13900K level, with the 13700K occasionally hitting that limit. This would be boosted with an overclock, as we saw earlier. The R7-2700 establishes the floor at 54 FPS average with these settings, and to bring attention to a few other older mainstays, users of the 3600, 3700X, and more modern 5600 and 5600X have plenty to gain if running on lower settings or overpowered on the GPU. X3D CPUs don't appear to offer as much of an advantage as we've seen in other games, with the 7800 X3D capping out at 124 FPS average, leading the 7700X by 15%. The 7950 X3D struggles with its usual oddities, despite using the core parking behaviors and the specialized OS setup that we detailed in our review. It's okay, but not scaling for the price. For some other comparisons, the R7-5800 X3D leads the 5600X by 20%, the 13600K leads the 7700X by about 10%, and the 13900K leads the 13600K by about 18%, at least until we start becoming limited. Let's move on to the realistic but GPU limited setting. At 1080p high, we've lost about 22 FPS average off the 13900K ceiling, and we've truncated the 13700K in the process. There's also a 13900K with a 7900XCX on here, where we gained about 3.7%, similar number to before. But again, we use the 4090 for our test because this is a standard CPU review GPU that we use. In other words, for all our CPU reviews, this is what we use. And given the general proximity, we still get the most scaling here while still being able to remain consistent for our future CPU test suite. The 13600K and down have lost some frame rate from the average, but overall, we were CPU bound before, and we remain CPU bound now for those CPUs. Compared to other modern titles, we're definitely running a relatively low frame rate for 1080p, and that's especially true considering there's no ray tracing. This game is heavy, and there probably is a lot of room for optimization, both at the driver level and at the game and engine level. That's especially because the game engine remains a Frankenstein Bethesda monster. One last chart. We did a quick validation test at the beginning of all this work against that 7900XCX versus the 4090. And we saw that the two were within about 3 to 4% of each other, even at a ridiculous 720p low configuration. This represented to us that for purposes of selecting a GPU for a CPU-bound specific set of tests, either one would be fine. 720p low is an incredibly low GPU load, obviously, and yet we were at the same frame rate. By traditional understanding, this tells us that the GPUs cannot differentiate themselves because other things are dictating the performance ceiling, like the CPU. It's useful here, since this is a CPU scaling comparison. We ultimately stuck with the 4090 for all the tests, unless listed otherwise, because that's what we use in our standardized CPU reviews, and going forward, that's what we'll be using to compare. So just wrapping all this up as quickly as we can, there's really just the two main charts that matter the most for CPU comparisons in terms of scaling. A couple things we learned. First of all, at the very top end, you can definitely be clock bound. There's some benefit to overclocking to be had here. Probably for older CPUs, there's a lot more to gain from an OC because you're likely to be a lot more CPU bound. So the game, generally speaking, is very GPU heavy. You start getting into 1440p or higher, or ultra settings or something, even high setting, it is going to be more likely that you're GPU bound than not. But in situations where you are CPU limited, like say on an R7-2700, 3700X, something like a 12400, a 13400, something like that 3100F, any of those types of CPUs, you have some options. And in cases where they are unlocked CPUs, like the older Ryzen stuff especially, we think if you haven't yet, it's a good time to explore overclocking because you can actually get some clock scaling benefit here. For people who are considering new purchases, a couple takeaways. We saw in modern architectures, there's some core count scaling between, say, 6-core and 8-core CPU. It's not huge, but it exists. So there's some benefit there, that's speaking to AMD specifically. Then on Intel, you look at 13.9, 13.7, you are more likely to start bouncing off of the GPU limit because realistically, you're probably not playing at 1080p low or something. If you're using a 13900K, you're probably trying to push the graphics a little bit, or your system would be wildly imbalanced for component selection. So, factoring that into consideration, if you're playing at, say, 1080p high, 1440 plus, with any reasonable settings, then the 13.7, the 13.9, they're going to be very close to each other so as to be functionally the same. You're more GPU limited in that scenario. The 13.6 is actually pretty close to them as well, and there's more graphics intensive load scenarios. So really, we see the most scaling at the older or the lower end of the stack. And then finally, the GPU busy part is just sort of cool. It's different, it's new information that we haven't presented before. and we're really excited about where we can go with it because it gives us some more insight into how things are behaving in the system. The ratio thing, we got to figure out where to best leverage that, but it's starting to make sense. Like, it's starting to click for us. I can see that there's something there, and we're on the way to it, but this is going to develop a lot with time because it takes a while. It took a while for frame times to really catch on and people to wrap their heads around it as a presentation method. It'll take the same sort of effort here with GP but it's pretty cool stuff so far, and we're super excited about it. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, you can go to store.gamersaccess.net to grab one of our GN15 mod mats. They are on the store. You can get them right now. They have a bunch of new icons and the new GN15 logo, plus some new diagrams for helping you in PC builds. And otherwise, subscribe for more. You can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to throw us a few bucks if you find these types of videos helpful, and we'll see you all next time.
What made Cyberpunk fail? I haven't watched one of this guy's videos for a while.
Okay, today is possibly a very important video.
That's good.
June 23rd at precisely 9:34 a.m., I received an email. This email was from a whistleblower claiming to be an employee of Quantic Lab. For those that don't know, Quantic Lab is a QA testing company, an outsourced quality assurance company, to be precise, operating out of Romania. Initially intended to be a game development company, that business model proved unviable at the time, and a transition was made into quality assurance.
Smart.
Quantic Lab has a bit of a bumpy history. After bankruptcy early on, they were acquired by THQ Nordic, and then in late 2020, finalized in 2021, I believe, they were acquired in a bulk purchase by Embracer Group, which is an industry powerhouse. Specifics and timeline aside, Quantic Lab has operated as a QA testing company for some very large names in the industry over these past years. Right. Adding this in after the fact, it occurs to me that I should probably define what outsourced QA actually is. Let's say you're a publisher and you have a video game or a piece of software.
You pay people to make sure it's good.
Similar. How do you go about improving it? Well, you have a variety of different options, but one of the most important things that you can do is have it tested by a team of people who are dedicated to finding when, where, and specifically how it breaks. Now, some publishers have what's called in-house QA teams, which is a...
This is the Blizzard has in-house QA teams. Basically, what the QA team does at Blizzard is... So yeah, and so we'll get back to the video.
Separate department of testers under the same corporate banner who fulfill that role. But many publishers and software companies actually don't have in-house teams, and instead they outsource the process of testing for bugs, glitches, and other defects to a third party.
There's a friend of mine that was working on one of these companies.
Is a third party that takes on the responsibility of testing products, because theoretically they are able to then standardize and perfect that procedure for maximized results. Game developers have a particular skill set, and quality assurance is actually a completely different skill set. So we don't expect, nor should we expect, that the same team who made the game itself does all of the rigorous testing required to ensure that it's ready to ship.
No.
That is what Quantic Lab does.
Right, yeah, it makes
quality
sense.
assurance. According to their website, they have worked on titles like Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, Cyberpunk 2077, and I hope...
I'm gonna be honest. I think they should take that one off of their website. Yeah, just take that one off the site. Because, like, you know, it didn't really, it was, like, fucked up on release, so it's like, maybe you just shouldn't have that one on there.
Most of smaller projects as well. For today, we need to focus primarily on Cyberpunk 2077, because it is one of the most high-profile examples in all of gaming.
A lot of people
know my source was exceptionally clear that this kind of scenario is not isolated to just one game
or one
project. Nearly everyone involved in video games has likely heard of Cyberpunk 2077. It is one of the most famous examples of launch day failure in existence, and yet the true reason for that failure is almost a total mystery. Some will tell you that it came from corporate oversight, management failure, and shareholder expectations that led to the spiral of bad decision-making. But
my assumption of why Cyberpunk didn't go well is because it was going to be released during COVID. I thought part of it was COVID, and part of it was like their ego. That like, oh, they're like, oh, well, we made Witcher 3. Of course this game's going to be good. That's what I thought it was going to be. Like, I don't know, but that was my assumption of why the game went badly.
Developers themselves were largely innocent. This is likely true to a significant degree, but is it the only thing? Others will claim that they simply bit off more than they could chew. Technology wasn't ready for this level of ambition. This was inevitably going to happen as the marketing cycle spun out of control. There are a multitude of theories, claims, and speculation. But today I want to highlight the information I was given and put forward an entirely different explanation. which will simultaneously shed light on an area of the gaming industry that needs radical improvement.
Okay.
This is where I have to clarify a few things. This is a whistleblower, highlighting what may very well be illegal corporate practices, while violating their non-disclosure agreement in order to put forward the truth.
Wow.
To bolster credibility and verify legitimacy, they sent a series of documents. I've been able to examine a 72-page QA testing file, Quantic Lab human resources paperwork, workflow charts, production maps, detailed spreadsheets tracking productivity, and some additional documentation from very early in the QA/development process. These are blurred in totality because I'm fairly sure that they are confidential, highly confidential, and that...
Do you guys believe it? I believe it. Yeah, I believe it. I believe it, yep.
...basis could be used to take down the video if I show them directly. My subjective opinion from examining these files is that they are legitimate. The annotations seem real when compared to actual in-game missions, employee names, and dialogue. The timeline matches perfectly when compared to development roadmaps and the alleged issues, plus a few other things that lead me to believe that this person is exactly who they say they are, and does have internal knowledge of the corporate and functional environment inside Quantic Lab.
Okay.
However, I do not have internal corporate memos or email chains and policy paperwork that mirrors the specific claims that they make in terms of illegal activity. That kind of information would almost certainly expose their identity right off the
They
bat.
wouldn't do it on an email. Like, you don't type on an email. Like, you know this, right? It's like, so if you... Like, this is why most people, it's like if you're doing anything illegal a lot, people don't use smartphones a lot to do that. They use a fucking flip phone because there's less technology in them. This is probably less the case now, but it was more the case then. And so, Ohio, thank you very much for the 20 gifted subs. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, you have the burner phone, exactly. And so, anyway, you got this, and on top of that, you have other just common sense measures where you just don't say what you're doing in the emails or in like the phone calls, because you never know what's gonna get you caught.
If showcased anyway, and the company allegedly has extremely tight control over what you can and cannot say, with strict and very aggressive non-disclosure agreements, as well as security measures to prevent leaked material. So the point here is, I believe the source to be real. They have provided extensive evidence to support that fact, and have made serious claims about the quality of QA activities at Quantic Lab.
I feel like this guy, like, very rarely has he come out with like stuff that's been bullshit. Like, yeah, and it's like also, I think another